Hey Northside, and welcome to the Yes Appendix. And we want to take a moment to talk about how do you deepen your yes, because we've been talking about this as a church for the past 6 weeks. So how do we live our yes beyond this series? And in the back of your yes book, there's a spiritual exercise called a rule of life. And we want to talk a little bit more about that because what this is designed to do, it's a spiritual practice to help you say yes to the right things so you can embolden your no to some of the things that distract you, some of the things that don't need to be a priority in your life. And so Jim Profs is hanging out with me today. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. So I'm going to throw a question to you, Jim. And it's a real big question, simple question of just why. Why a rule of life? Give us some of the little bit of the history behind it and why this can be important to us.
Sure. History real quick, I would say, I believe it's 540 AD, something like that, is when Saint Benedict, I think it's attributed to him first, where it was, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be very meticulous and intentional. I will this, I won't this. Here's my my boundaries, my borders to know if I'm doing things right. And it wasn't like a manual to operate some heavy equipment. It was, how do I walk through life and know if I'm hitting it right? It really goes back further. It goes to Paul talking with Timothy, the idea of training yourself in godliness, and that we'd be intentional about it. When Paul talks to Timothy and says train, or to exercise, or even work out your salvation, all those kind of conversations are about saying it should be intentional. There should be some plans. It goes on, I think we've got this in our resource here. Jonathan Edwards back in the 1700s, same thing. His was different. He called it a resolution, but the big idea is be intentional. And it's not to create some new legalistic mess. It's to give you guardrails to know, am I living the way I intended to live under Christ's reign and rule, or have I started to drift? And really, that's what it does.
Yeah, well, it's that moment, if we go back to week 2, where the disciples come looking for Jesus. Like, everyone is looking for you, and he's out praying, spending time with God, because that was part of his rule of life. Other demands and things were happening, but this was the priority. So he could say no to that to say yes to God. That's the idea behind it. So so a little bit of the why. Now let's talk about the how. That's where some of the book comes in. So walk us through a little bit of that. Okay, how do we start crafting a rule of life? What are some of the things that we need to be thinking about?
So Stephen Macchia wrote a book called Crafting a Rule of Life, and that's probably the best of its kind. Ken Shigematsu, there's a name for you.
I'm glad you got it right.
Well, as far as you know, I got it right.
Yeah, that's true.
Ken Shigematsu has a book called God in My Everything, and both of them talk about this. We've got this trellis concept, this idea of, it's a Greek word that's translated trellis for us. Think about a garden trellis where you kind of lay out something that you can grow upon, something that will give you something to cling to as you climb and try to grow in your maturity. That's what this rule is. And so they've got great examples there, but if you're not going to read the book, if you're not going to dive into that, the big idea is really just start to map out, maybe in your group, maybe with your spouse, in your own quiet time. Lord, what am I hearing from you? Things that I need to do. Billy Graham did this really, really well with what was called the Modesto Manifesto, and he just had 4 really, really firm rules. Things that I'm going to say yes to every time, things I won't ever do, that kind of thing. And so maybe you've got a list. There's an example here in the book, but you can frame it up as here's the yes list and here's the no list. But the goal isn't to have it done and it's sealed and it's inerrant. No chance. You will never write it. The goal is to use it as a workbook of sorts. I started my first one, I think, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, and I've refined it many, many times, and most recently about a year ago. But let this be a worksheet, and let it be the kind of thing that will kind of trip something in your mind to go, oh, I'm starting to drift from what I thought I was committing to when I said yes to Jesus. Or here's some things that will remind me to say no over here. But a worksheet, it's not inerrant. It will continue to be updated, and that's probably a good start.
Yeah, that's a great start. And like I said, Jim mentioned it, like in your book, there's a few questions just to help you start to get thinking about what your rule of life could be. And there's place to journal and write in there. And I think it's in Macchia's book where he kind of even breaks down crafting the rule of life into 5 categories of what are your priorities when it comes to growing in your spiritual life? What are your priorities growing in your relational life? What are your priorities growing in your physical exercise, health? What are your priorities in financial and missional? He breaks it down into those 5 categories to say, okay, what are my rule of life in these 5 areas? And you mentioned it again that it's a working document because life changes, season changes, and there are moments where we spend more times on different areas than others. And the other thing, we were just talking about it earlier, taking it back to, I think it was week 3 in the unexpected. Yes, is that we can't get too legalistic with something. This is about hearing the voice of God and being intentional about realigning ourselves. And that's what the Pharisees lacked back in the unexpected. Yes, that's why Jesus says, go learn this. I desire mercy over sacrifice. They had a rule of life that they were sticking hard and fast to, and they weren't going to change it. And Jesus says, okay, let me speak into this. There are some rhythms that you are missing. So the rule of life is to help create that framework. So I feel like so that we have a deeper yes, but we have, as we talked about obedience at the end of it, that we have a bolder no. Because we've said yes to these things, these are our priorities, then we can say no to other things. Not that sometimes those are good things, but sometimes we need to say no to good things to make room for great things and the things that God wants to do for us.
2 quick reactions to that. One is the Pharisees got to the point where when literally the Son of Man, Son of God was standing there, they're like, no, we've already got this figured out. We're not listening.
We don't need you,
This should help us to be able to hear him better, not stop listening. And the other thing is, if we craft this wonderful airtight document and we have it tucked away in our desk somewhere where no one else sees it, that's not helpful. The scary thing is to be able to say, here's mine. Would you follow up with me? If you see me missing this, let me know. My wife has mine. My kids have mine. My adult children. Good spiritual mentors of mine have mine. And
I don't know which would be worse, my wife or my kids calling me out on something.
Here's worse, when they get together and they and they say collectively, we've been talking and you've been missing it. But yes and no. It's painful, but it's awesome when it's done well.
So, well, that's a little bit on crafting a rule of life. And I want to encourage you, as we're talking about this is sparking something in you and maybe in your group, take this appendix and maybe as an idea, you do this as one night of your group. You give everybody the homework, you head out during the week and start crafting a rule of life. You don't have to have a finished document, just a working one. And maybe you come back in your group and talk about it. Invite other people into that. Maybe you help each other craft those rules of life. But don't disregard this practice because it is a great way for you to continue to say yes beyond this series.